The small town of West Hollow has always been known for its tranquility. Surrounded by dense pine forests and protected by high mountains, the town lived in a kind of comfortable isolation, where each day was a silent repetition of the previous one. The residents have been the same for decades, with few new faces appearing over the years. The climate was mild, and life's problems seemed, in a way, to bypass it. But this routine peace was about to be shattered in a way that no one could have predicted. It all started one fall morning. It was an ordinary day, except for one detail: the fog. It came out of nowhere, thick and cold, gliding through the streets like a thick veil that engulfed everything in its path. At first, the locals found it strange, but they didn't worry. After all, the city had seen fog before. However, there was something different about this fog. It was heavier, almost suffocating, and brought a disturbing silence that seemed to drown out even the sound of birds. The first to notice the strangeness were the fishermen who woke up early for work. When they launched their boats on the lake, they noticed that the mist didn't just cover the surface of the water. It moved, undulating as if it had a life of its own. It was as if something was watching them from behind that white curtain. "It's just a morning fog," they said to each other, trying to hide their growing discomfort. But the fog didn't disappear with the sun. It remained there, hanging over the city, obscuring the treetops and enveloping the houses. As the day progressed, the residents began to feel an unusual unease. The mist seemed to follow each one of them, even inside their own homes, making windows cloudy and doors heavy. Some swore they heard whispers but laughed at themselves, attributing it to their imagination. However, these whispers were like a low hum, an incomprehensible language that ingrained itself in the mind. Then, the first disappearance happened. Mark Davis, a 65-year-old man who lived alone on the outskirts of town, went out to fetch his dog, which had run off into the mist. He never returned. The neighbors found only the dog, lying on the porch of his house, looking glassy-eyed and distant. There was no sign of Mark. The search began immediately. Police officers, friends, and neighbors scoured every corner of the city, but the fog made everything difficult, distorting sound and vision. It was like trying to walk in a bad dream, where every step seemed to go in the wrong direction. Mark's only clue was a pair of footprints that started at the door of his house and ended abruptly in the street, where the fog was thicker. As the days passed, the fog began to become more persistent. The sun seemed powerless against it, as if it had given up trying to dispel its oppressive presence. Children were kept indoors, and adults avoided going out after dark. It wasn't just the fog that frightened them, but what it seemed to hide. The figures that some residents claimed to have seen. Human forms, but no faces, no features, just shadows of who they had been. Despite the growing fear, no one knew how to explain it. The local authority tried to reassure the population, claiming that it was just a natural phenomenon and that Mark had probably gotten lost in the forest, hoping that this would be enough to calm everyone down. But there was no denying that the town was changing. The smiles were disappearing, as were the colors of the place. Everything seemed colder, darker. At the end of the day, when the mist finally retreated into the depths of the forest, there was a heavy silence, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for the next morning. And in every house, people wondered, what was the fog hiding? West Hollow, once a living city, was becoming an empty reflection of itself, a silent victim of something no one understood. And as the fog continued to hover, everyone knew that this was only the beginning. The disappearance of Mark Davis was just the beginning. As the days went by, the fog became a constant presence in West Hollow, like a gloomy curtain that hung over the town, swallowing up entire streets and enveloping houses. in its cold cloak. The climate in the town changed drastically. What was once a peaceful and welcoming community was now plunged into fear and uncertainty. The residents' unease grew with each new day. Rumors began to circulate, increasing the tension. Some people swore they saw faceless figures lurking around the edges of the mist, human silhouettes, but without eyes, noses, or mouths. Others reported hearing whispers at nightfall, faint, disconnected voices that seemed to come from somewhere inside the mist, calling out their names or repeating meaningless words. But no one knew for sure what was real and what was the result of panic. Little by little, more people began to disappear. First there was Emily Parker, a young mother who left to pick up her daughter from school and never returned. Her car was found on the side of the road, doors open, headlights on, but no sign of her. The daughter, when asked, simply said that the fog took Mom. Then there was old Roger, who used to walk through the park every morning. One day, he simply didn't come home. His dog, a faithful old Labrador, was found in front of the park, barking desperately at the mist that covered the path. The community was in shock. The local authorities were perplexed, unable to explain what was happening. Sheriff Coleman, a pragmatic and respected man in the town, led the search for Emily and Roger, but found nothing but footprints that abruptly disappeared, as if the people had been erased from the world. The fog was thick and treacherous, and the search dogs refused to enter it, whimpering and refusing to move forward, as if they sensed the presence of something evil. Little by little, the city began to change its routines. People avoided going out, especially at night. The stores closed early, and the streets that were once bustling and full of life were now deserted and silent. The few who ventured out constantly looked over their shoulders, as if expecting to be followed by something invisible. Children no longer played in the streets, and laughter was replaced by whispers and low conversations, as if even sound could attract the unwanted attention of the fog. The protagonist, Michael, who until then had treated all this as an exaggeration, began to worry seriously when his best friend, Tom, also disappeared. Tom was just as skeptical as Michael, always scoffing at rumors and laughing at the stories his elders told. On that fateful night, Tom decided to defy the fog, believing it was just a coincidence. He was last seen entering the woods, flashlight in hand and a confident smile on his face. When Michael heard that Tom hadn't returned, a chill ran down his spine. He knew that his friend wasn't the type to disappear without any news. Desperate, Michael decided to go to Tom's house, but found only his mother, a haggard woman with eyes red from crying, holding a wool cutsherd that Tom had left behind. "He said he'd be back soon," she whispered. But they both knew that something terrible had happened. Over the next few days, the search for Tom became frantic. Michael, accompanied by a few other friends, explored every corner of the woods, but found nothing but more footprints disappearing into the mist. The feeling of helplessness grew with each day, and the fear that anyone who could be the next victim of the mist was eating away at the villagers' minds. Theories began to proliferate. Some believed that the fog was a divine punishment. Others spoke of an ancient curse, while the more pragmatic tried to find a scientific explanation, perhaps an unknown chemical reaction in the air. But none of these theories were any consolation, and no one knew how to stop the fog or how to protect themselves from it. With the city on the brink of despair, Michael began to feel the weight of responsibility. He knew he had to do something to understand what was happening and find Tom. But every time he looked into that dense, impenetrable fog, he felt a growing fear that if he went into it, he wouldn't come back either. And so West Hollow continued to live under the shadow of the fog, its inhabitants fearing what the future held for them. while more and more people disappeared, leaving only emptiness and uncertainty in their wake. The city, once alive and kicking, was slowly being swallowed up by a darkness that no one could explain. Tom's disappearance was the turning point for Michael. The city was suffused with fear, and he knew he had to act before it was too late. The stories about the mist and the faceless figures no longer seemed to be just the superstitions of haunted minds. They were real, and Michael felt that if he didn't do something, he too would end up succumbing to that dark fate. Determined to find answers, Michael decided to do what many other residents feared: face the mist head-on. He prepared himself as best he could with a powerful flashlight, his camera, and a voice recorder. He didn't know exactly what he expected to find, but he felt he needed to document everything. If he disappeared like the others, he wanted to leave a trace, something that could at least make sense of what was happening. That night, the fog was particularly dense, covering every corner of the city like a heavy, oppressive cloak. The streets were deserted, and Michael felt the strange sensation that the city had been abandoned, as if everyone knew that something terrible was about to happen. He walked slowly towards the entrance to the woods, where the fog seemed to be thicker, like a wall that blocked any attempt to see beyond a few meters ahead. With the flashlight in one hand and the camera in the other, Michael took the first step into the mist. The darkness seemed to absorb the light, rendering the flashlight useless, which only illuminated a small area around it. The silence was total, as if the whole world had fallen silent, and Michael began to hear only his own breathing, which was becoming increasingly rapid and irregular. As he advanced, he began to notice that the mist was not homogeneous. It moved in a strange way, almost as if it had a life of its own. Small currents of air made it ripple, and at times Michael thought he saw indistinct shapes moving around him. They were only shadows at first, but as he got further into the woods, the shapes began to take on a more distinct shape. Michael stopped suddenly. There, a few meters away, something was moving in the mist. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline overwhelming him. Slowly, he pointed the flashlight in the direction of the figure and was paralyzed by what he saw. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The silhouette was clearly human, but what made it terrifying was the absence of a face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was just a smooth, pale surface with no identifying features. The figure stood still, as if waiting for something. Michael took a step back, and as he did so, he felt something brush against his back. He turned quickly and saw another figure, identical to the first, emerging from the mist. They were everywhere, slowly emerging, surrounding him, all faceless, without identity, just shadows of who they once were. Panic seized Michael, but he knew that running away was not an option. He raised the camera and started filming, trying to capture as much as he could. But the figures didn't move to attack him. They just stood there, watching him, or so it seemed. It was as if the mist was playing with him, showing him what happened to those who got lost in it. It was then that Michael heard the whispers. They weren't coming from the figures, but from the mist itself. It was an incomprehensible language, distorted and dark, which seemed to echo inside his head. The sounds made him feel dizzy, as if he was about to lose consciousness. Each word, although unintelligible, carried an immense weight, as if he were being pressed down by something invisible. Desperate, Michael tried to go back the way he came, but the fog seemed to have closed in behind him, distorting his surroundings and confusing his senses. He began to run without direction, just wanting to escape the nightmare. The faceless figures followed him closely, their movement slow but relentless, as if they had all the time in the world to catch up. For a moment, He saw a light in the distance. It seemed like a way out, a point of hope in that sea of despair. With all the strength he still had, he ran towards the light, ignoring the whispers that were now screams in his head. When he finally reached the light, he realized he was back at the entrance to the woods, the city visible ahead, the mist receding as if it had been defeated by his determination. Michael stumbled and fell to his knees, exhausted and terrified, but still alive. The figures had disappeared, and the mist, although still present, seemed less dense, less threatening. He looked around, trying to find some explanation for what he had just experienced, but all he found was emptiness. With trembling hands, he switched off the camera and forced himself to stand up. He knew he had to get out of there, but something inside him told him that it wasn't over. The fog had revealed part of his secret, but there was still a lot he didn't understand. And as he walked home, he felt a strange sensation that although he had escaped for the time being, the mist had not given up on him. West Hollow remained a town on the brink of collapse, its residents dreading the next dawn, while Michael, now aware of the real horror that inhabited the mist, knew he had to find out the truth before it was too late. And with that grim resolution, he prepared himself for what was to come, aware that real terror still awaited him. The encounter with the faceless figures left Michael distraught. The images captured by the camera were fuzzy, fragmented, as if the fog had distorted the technology itself. The light from the flashlight seemed to fail in the recordings, and the sounds of whispering were just low, unsettling noises, but the faceless figures were there, visible in the background, still like specters from an endless nightmare. Michael knew that what he had seen was real, but he needed more answers. In the days that followed, he immersed himself in obsessive research about the town. West Hollow had a long history, but there was something that had never been openly discussed. Michael visited the local library, where the dusty old archives told a different story from the one everyone knew. Among yellowed newspapers and dusty records, he began to piece together a dark puzzle, pieces of a forgotten past that shed light on the terrifying present. It was in an old newspaper from 1923 that Michael found the first real clue, an article reporting a tragic event in the town known as the Night of Shadows. That year, West Hollow was going through a severe crisis. Crops were failing, diseases were spreading, and residents believed the town was cursed. In desperation, some of the older residents resorted to ancient rituals, practices that had been passed down for generations, hidden from the church and the authorities. These rituals were known for trying to manipulate forces that could not be understood. A group of residents, led by a man called Alistair Crowley, a name that was still whispered among the older families, performed a ritual to protect the town from future calamities. But something went wrong. That night, a thick fog descended on West Hollow for the first time, and when the sun rose, 8 people were missing, including Alistair. They were never seen again, and the search found no bodies, only footprints disappearing into the mist. The community was terrified and, out of fear, buried the story. Any mention of the ritual was forbidden, and people began to treat the mist as a silent curse, something that everyone feared but no one dared mention. Gradually, the memories of that event faded with time, but the mist, Michael now understood, had not completely dissipated. It was just waiting. Michael continued his investigations, visiting the older residents, those who still remembered the stories told by their grandparents, stories that no one believed to be real until the fog returned. One gentleman, Arthur, who lived on the edge of town, was the one who revealed the last piece of the puzzle. He was a reclusive man with snow-white hair and eyes that seemed to have seen more than anyone should. Arthur told Michael that the mist was not just an entity, but a guardian of lost souls. The ritual had trapped something in the city, an ancient spirit that fed on people's identities, their souls, leaving them as empty husks. That's why they don't have faces, Arthur explained in a low, trembling voice. The mist steals everything that makes them human, leaving only their form. And the more it feeds on them, the stronger they become. Those figures you saw, they are the lost ones. They are trapped between our world and the other, without identity, without a soul. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. The mist didn't just swallow people. It erased them completely, turning them into faceless specters that wandered forever. And with each new victim, the mist grew, expanding its domains like an invisible parasite. If no one did anything, the whole city could disappear, consumed by the darkness they themselves had awakened. But Arthur also had an answer, albeit a terrible one. To end the curse, the ritual had to be reversed, but that required a sacrifice. Someone had to offer their own identity to the mist, giving themselves up completely in order to undo the bond that kept it alive. Michael was faced with an impossible dilemma: how to choose who should sacrifice themselves. Would he himself have the courage to enter the mist and lose everything that made him human? Arthur warned him that trying to deceive the mist would be useless. It was ancient and knew how to recognize the truth. Only genuine surrender could break the cycle. Michael, now carrying the weight of this discovery, felt more lost than ever. The city depended on him, but the price to pay was something he didn't know if he could demand of himself or anyone else. As he left Arthur's house, Michael looked at the city he knew so well and felt as if he were seeing it for the last time. The fog was still there, hovering around the edges of West Hollow, patient, waiting for the next dawn, the next victim. Michael knew that time was running out and that he would have to make a decision soon. And as night fell, once again bringing the heavy blanket of fog over the town, Michael prepared himself for the sacrifice that could save them all or condemn them forever. The clock was ticking, and the hungry mist would not wait forever. The night was especially cold when Michael finally made his decision. Arthur's words echoed in his mind. The only way to break the curse was a genuine sacrifice, someone willing to surrender their identity to the mist, erasing themselves forever from the world. Michael knew he couldn't ask anyone else to take on this responsibility. It was a weight that he and he alone had to carry. As the mist slowly crept through the deserted streets of West Hollow, Michael walked towards the center of town, where everything seemed to be suspended in time, as if the very air was impregnated with fear. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the soft sound of his footsteps and the distant whispers coming from the fog. The city slept, but Michael knew that soon everyone would wake up to another day of terror unless he did what needed to be done. He headed for the old park, the same place where Tom had disappeared. It was one of the spots where the fog seemed thickest, most alive. Michael carried only an old book with him, the diary of Aleister Crowley that Arthur had given him, with the detailed instructions for the ritual that had cursed West Hollow so many decades ago. He knew he had to do it again, but this time, unlike the previous residents, he had to complete it with a real sacrifice. As he prepared the circle with the candles and symbols that Aleister had described, Michael felt a presence around him. He was not alone. The faceless figures he had seen before slowly began to form in the mist, surrounding him in a silent circle. They were the lost souls of West Hollow, those who had been devoured by the mist over the years. Michael recognized some of them. Old Mark, Emily, Tom, all now shadows of what they once were. Without identity, without hope, Michael opened the book and began to recite the old words, a language that made no sense, but seemed to resonate with the mist around him. The mist reacted, rippling, as if it were alive, as if it understood what was about to happen. The whispers increased, turning into a chorus of desperate voices, muffled cries that seemed to beg for release. At the final moment, Michael hesitated. He looked at the faceless figures around him and felt a deep pain in his chest. They weren't monsters. They were people who had lost everything, and he knew that if he failed, if he retreated now, he would join them. And the mist would continue to expand, swallowing everyone in its path. With tears in his eyes, Michael took the last step into the circle. He closed his eyes and pronounced the final words of the ritual. The mist swirled violently, like a chained beast finally tasting freedom. Michael felt the air being pulled from his lungs, as if something was sucking out his very essence. He knew he was losing his identity. He felt himself emptying out, fading away. His vision began to blur, and he could barely make out the outlines of the city he loved so much. When the last sound of the fog echoed, Michael opened his eyes. He was no longer in the park, but in a place between worlds, a vast expanse of white and silence, where faceless figures now walked free. They turned towards him, and for the first time, he saw in them a kind of peace. Michael understood that he had played his part. He had freed the trapped souls, but at the cost of his own. Back in town, the mist began to dissipate slowly, as if it were being sucked into the void. The residents of West Hollow, waking up to the new day, saw the sun for the first time in weeks. There was no more fog, and the missing people, although never found, were not forgotten. Memories became clear again, and the town felt that something had changed forever. Michael, however, never came back. There was no body, no trace of him, just Aleister Crowley's diary, open in the middle of the park, its final pages torn and scattered by the wind. The locals understood what he had done, but they never knew the true sacrifice he had made. For them, Michael had become a legend, a silent hero who had saved everyone, even if it meant losing himself.